The following account is based on a series of calls made to Coast AM with Art Bell between 1997 and 2002. The caller identified himself as Mel Waters, a property owner in rural Kittitas County, Washington. While the original broadcasts are well documented, what follows includes additional details that Mel shared privately with researchers years later. Details he was initially too frightened to reveal on national radio.
My name is Mel Waters, and I need to tell you about the hole. I've been sitting on this story for over 20 years now, watching it eat away at me like acid on metal. Every time I tried to forget, to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild in those lonely woods, something would happen to remind me. A sound in the night, a shadow where shadows shouldn't be, that damned crow that still watches my house. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, back in 1997, when I thought the worst thing about living on 40 acres of remote Washington wilderness was the isolation. I'd bought the property in Kittitas County sight unseen. Just wanted to get away from Seattle, from the noise and the people and the complications of modern life. The previous owner, an old rancher named Henrik Olson, had died the winter before, and his family was eager to sell. They practically threw the deed at me, seemed almost relieved to be rid of it. The land was beautiful in that stark, high desert way that eastern Washington does so well. Rolling hills covered in sagebrush and scattered pines, with the Cascade Mountains rising like sleeping giants on the western horizon. My nearest neighbor was Earl Patterson, whose property line ran along mine about half a mile through the trees. Good man, kept to himself, which suited me fine. It was while walking the boundary lines that fall, getting to know my new domain, that I first found it. I almost stepped right into the thing. Hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown brush and fallen logs, there was a hole, perfectly round, about 9 feet across, lined with what looked like hand-cut stones around the rim. The stonework was old. You could tell by the way the edges had worn smooth and the moss had grown thick in the joints. But it was clearly man-made, too precise to be natural. I figured it was an old well, maybe built by homesteaders back in the 1800s. Kittitas County was full of abandoned farms and forgotten settlements. I cleared away the brush and got my first good look at it in the late afternoon sunlight. That's when I realized I couldn't see the bottom. Not unusual for an old well, I told myself, probably filled with debris over the years. But when I dropped a rock into it, listening for the splash or thud that would tell me how deep it went, I heard nothing. The stone just disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by silence so complete it seemed to muffle even the wind in the trees above. I went back to the house for a flashlight, but even its beam couldn't penetrate more than 20 or 30 feet down. The walls appeared to be lined with the same cut stone as the rim, disappearing into blackness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with determining the hole's depth. I started with fishing line, spooled out nearly 800 feet before running out of line without hitting bottom. Then I tried rope, first 100 feet, then 500, then every piece of rope I could buy from the hardware store in Ellensburg. At 1,500 feet, I was beginning to think my measurements were wrong, that somehow the line was getting tangled or caught on something. But the rope hung straight down, taut and true, disappearing into that perfect circle of darkness. I called my neighbor Earl, thinking maybe he knew something about the hole's history. When I described it to him over the phone, there was a long pause before he answered. "You found the old Olson well," he said finally, his voice strange and flat. "Henrik used to warn me away from that thing, said it was cursed, that nothing good ever came from messing with it. Did he ever tell you how deep it was?" Another pause. "Henrik said it didn't have a bottom. Said his grandfather told him the same thing, and his grandfather before that. Been in the family stories for generations. That should have been my first warning to leave it alone. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I was a man with too much time on his hands and too many questions that needed answers. It was in early November that I first noticed the animals acting strange. My property was home to the usual Pacific Northwest wildlife: deer, elk, black bears, cougars, and countless smaller creatures. I'd grown used to seeing tracks around the property, finding evidence of their passage in mud and snow. But after I'd started investigating the hole, that all stopped. The animals avoided the area completely now. Deer trails that had run within 100 yards of the hole simply ended, as if the creatures had hit an invisible wall and turned back. Birds that used to nest in the trees above the hole were gone, leaving bare branches that creaked ominously in the wind. Even my own dog, a German Shepherd mix named Rex, refused to go near it. The first time I tried to bring him along while I worked at the hole, he planted his feet about 50 yards away and whined until I let him go back to the house. After that, he'd disappear whenever he saw me heading in that direction. But it was the sounds that really got to me. It started as just a feeling, the sense that something was wrong with the silence around the hole. Normal forest sounds seemed muffled there, as if the air itself was thicker. But as the nights grew longer and colder, I began to hear things rising from the depths. Whispers so faint they might have been wind through the stones. A low, mechanical humming that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. And sometimes, late at night when the moon was dark, I swear I could hear crying, the sound of a child sobbing somewhere far below. I told myself it was the wind, that old wells often produced strange acoustics. But the sounds had a quality that made my teeth ache, a wrongness that went beyond mere air movement through stone. The first time I called Coast to Coast AM, I was halfway drunk and completely desperate for someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Art Bell was patient with me, asking questions that helped me organize my thoughts and observations. But even then, I held back the worst details. Some things are too strange to say out loud, even on a show dedicated to the paranormal. After that first call, things escalated quickly. Earl Patterson called me the next morning, his voice tight with fear. "Mel, I need to tell you something about that hole of yours. Something I should have mentioned before." He came over that afternoon, looking older than his 63 years, his hands shaking as he lit one cigarette after another. "My dog went missing 3 days ago," he said without preamble. "Old Blue, you remember him? 14-year-old beagle. Been with me since he was a pup. Found him yesterday morning, lying in my backyard, stiff as a board." I offered my condolences, but Earl waved them away. "That's not the strange part, Mel. Strange part is, I buried him yesterday afternoon. Dug a grave under the apple tree, said a few words, covered him up proper." Earl's cigarette trembled between his fingers. "This morning, I look out my kitchen window, and there's Blue, sitting in the exact same spot where I found him dead. The hair on my arms stood up." "That's impossible, Earl. Maybe it was another dog that... Same collar, same scar on his left ear from when he tangled with a porcupine 5 years back. Same everything." Earl stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. "Except his eyes, Mel. His eyes were all wrong. Black as coal, no white showing at all. And he wouldn't come when I called. Just sat there staring at me." Earl looked up, and I saw real terror in his weathered face. "I think that hole of yours brought him back, Mel. And I don't think what came back is really Blue. That evening, I saw the dog myself. Earl was right. It was unmistakably Blue, down to the gray muzzle and the way he held his left paw slightly off the ground. But those eyes, they were like looking into the hole itself, perfectly black and utterly empty of any emotion or recognition. The dog sat in Earl's yard for 3 days, never moving, never eating, just watching. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Earl never saw it again, but sometimes, walking near the hole at dusk, I catch glimpses of movement in the tree-line. A flash of brown and white fur, there and gone before I can focus on it. And always, always those terrible black eyes watching from the shadows. The government arrived on a Tuesday in early December. I first noticed the black SUVs parked along the county road, their occupants studying my property through binoculars. Then came the knock on my door, 3 men in dark suits claiming to be from the U.S. Geological Survey, investigating subsurface anomalies in the area. They were polite but firm, explaining that they needed to conduct tests on my property. When I asked about the specifics, they gave me vague answers about geological instability and potential environmental hazards. They showed me official-looking paperwork, but something about them felt wrong. Their suits were too expensive, their equipment too advanced, and they carried themselves like military rather than scientists. Within days, they'd cordon off a 100-yard radius around the hole with chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. Signs appeared overnight: authorized personnel only and danger. Unstable geological formation. I tried to approach the fence once, just to see what they were doing to my property. The man who stopped me was polite but carried a sidearm and made it clear that I wouldn't be allowed any closer. "For your own safety, Mr. Waters," he said, but his eyes suggested the safety in question was theirs, not mine. For 6 weeks, they worked around the clock. I could see lights moving around the perimeter at all hours, hear the sound of heavy machinery, the whir of generators running constantly. Helicopters came and went at odd hours, their rotors beating a rhythm that seemed to echo the mechanical humming I'd heard from the hole. Then, as suddenly as they'd arrived, they were gone. The fence remained, along with the warning signs, but the men and their equipment vanished overnight. When I called the county office to complain about the continuing restriction of my property, I was told that the area had been designated a federal research site and would remain off-limits indefinitely. But that wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning of the real terror. The night after the government team left, I was awakened by a sound I'd never heard before. A low, resonant tone that seemed to come from deep in the earth itself. It was like the world's largest tuning fork had been struck somewhere beneath my property, sending vibrations up through the bedrock and into my bones. I went outside to investigate and found my entire 40 acres covered in fog. Not the normal morning mist common to the area, but a thick, unnatural fog that seemed to glow faintly from within. It hung about 6 feet off the ground, creating a ceiling of gray-white vapor that blocked out the stars and moon. As I walked toward the restricted area, the fog grew thicker and the humming sound louder. The air itself felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike, making my skin prickle and my hair stand on end. Through the chain-link fence, I could see lights moving deep within the hole. Not the beam of flashlights or work lamps, but a pulsing, organic glow that shifted from blue to green to colors that don't have names. The lights moved with purpose, rising and falling in patterns that suggested intelligence, communication, perhaps even celebration. That's when I realized the government hadn't been trying to contain the hole. They'd been trying to establish contact with whatever was inside it. And they'd succeeded. The fog didn't lift for 3 days. During that time, I experienced things that still make me question my sanity. Sounds that weren't quite voices calling my name from the direction of the hole. Shadows that moved independently of any light source. The sensation of being watched by dozens of eyes, even when I was alone in my house with all the curtains drawn. On the 3rd night, Rex disappeared. I found him the next morning, sitting by the fence exactly as Earl's dog had sat in his yard. Same blank stare, same impossible black eyes, same unnatural stillness. But Rex was different in another way. He was perfectly clean, his coat gleaming as if he'd been bathed and groomed, despite having been missing for 12 hours in the muddy, fog-shrouded wilderness. When I approached, he tilted his head at an angle that was just slightly wrong, as if he was remembering how a dog was supposed to behave but couldn't quite get it right. "Rex," I called softly. The thing that had been my dog smiled. Not the panting, tongue-lolling expression of canine happiness, but an actual human smile. Lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too white, too sharp, arranged in a grin that stretched wider than any dog's mouth should allow. I ran back to the house and locked every door and window, but I could feel him out there, sitting patiently by the fence, waiting for something I didn't want to understand. The next morning, he was gone, but I knew he'd be back. They always come back. It was around this time that the crow first appeared. A single black bird, larger than any crow I'd ever seen, with feathers that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It perched on the power line outside my kitchen window every evening at sunset, fixing me with one unblinking eye that held far too much intelligence. Unlike the returned animals, the crow never tried to approach or interact. It simply watched, tilting its head occasionally as if listening to sounds I couldn't hear. But its presence was somehow more unsettling than the aggressive attention of the other creatures. The crow felt like a sentry, a guardian posted to observe and report back to something waiting in the depths below. Over the following months, I made several more calls to Coast AM, each time revealing a little more of what was happening on my property. Art Bell was fascinated by the story, and the calls generated significant listener interest. But I never told the complete truth. How could I? Who would believe that a hole in the ground was some kind of doorway, a passage between our world and somewhere else entirely? Because that's what I'd come to believe. The government's interest, the returned animals, the lights and sounds and wrongness that surrounded the site. None of it made sense if the hole was simply a very deep well. But it all fit perfectly if the hole was something else. A breach in reality itself, a wound in the fabric of space that allowed things to pass between dimensions. The evidence kept mounting. Neighbors reported missing pets that returned days later with those terrible black eyes. Hikers in the area complained of feeling watched, of hearing voices calling from empty forests. The local wildlife population crashed as animals fled the region entirely. And through it all, that crow watched from my power line, never missing a sunset, never showing any sign of normal bird behavior like eating or drinking or interacting with others of its kind. Just watching, waiting, keeping vigil over whatever was unfolding beneath the earth. The final confirmation came 2 years after my first discovery of the hole. I was walking the perimeter of my property one evening, staying well away from the restricted area but trying to get a sense of how far the wrongness was spreading. The air felt heavy, charged with the same electricity I'd experienced during the fog event, and I could hear that familiar mechanical humming rising from the direction of the hole. As I reached the northwestern corner of my land, I found fresh tire tracks in the mud, recent ones, made by a vehicle I didn't recognize. Following them led me to a service road I'd never noticed before, hidden by carefully arranged brush and no trespassing signs. The road led directly to the restricted area, but from an angle that avoided the main fence. Through the trees, I could see lights and movement, hear the sound of generators and equipment running. The government team hadn't left. They'd simply moved their operation out of sight. But what I saw through my binoculars that night changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. The original fence was still there, but it had been supplemented by a much larger perimeter that enclosed nearly 10 acres. Within that area, I could see structures that definitely weren't part of any geological survey. Concrete bunkers, communication arrays, what looked like laboratory facilities built directly around the hole itself. And people were going down into it. I watched them for over an hour, teams of figures in white hazmat suits being lowered into the hole on mechanized platforms, disappearing into that perfect circle of darkness. Some came back up, others didn't. But the most disturbing part was what I saw rising from the hole between the human expeditions. Shapes that weren't quite human, moving with that same wrong rhythm I'd observed in the returned animals. They emerged from the darkness like swimmers surfacing from deep water, pausing at the rim to orient themselves before dispersing into the surrounding forest. I was witnessing an exchange, a trade agreement between our world and whatever existed on the other side of that impossible depth. And I understood, with a clarity that made my blood freeze, that I had been the initial point of contact. My discovery of the hole, my investigation, my calls to national radio. All of it had served to announce humanity's presence to something that had been waiting patiently in the dark. The crow on my power line turned to look directly at me, and for one terrifying moment, I could swear it nodded. I moved away from the property 6 months later, selling to a shell company that paid cash and asked no questions. But distance doesn't matter when you've seen what I've seen, when you've been marked by something that exists beyond our normal understanding of space and time. The crow followed me to my new home in Oregon. It's still there every evening, perched outside whatever window gives it the best view of my daily activities. A constant reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I know now that the hole isn't just deep, it's infinite, a wound that extends not down but across, connecting our reality to others in ways that human physics can't explain. And something on the other side has been using that connection to study us, to understand us, to slowly replace us with versions that serve its purposes. The returned animals were just the beginning. By now, there are probably hundreds of people walking around with those same black eyes, those same too perfect smiles, carrying out whatever agenda their masters have planned. I break my silence now because I'm dying, cancer, the doctors say, though I suspect my exposure to whatever emanates from that hole has more to do with it than they realize. I want someone to know the truth before it's too late, before the exchange program reaches a tipping point and the replacements outnumber the originals. If you're ever in Kittitas County, Washington, and you see warning signs around a fenced-off area, don't investigate. Don't ask questions. Don't do what I did and let curiosity override common sense. Some holes are meant to stay covered. Some depths are meant to remain unplumbed. And some silences should never be broken. But it's too late for that now. The hole has been found, the contact has been made, and the exchange is well underway. The crow outside my window just nodded again, and for the first time in 25 years, it spread its wings and flew away. I think that means they're finished with me. I think that means it's time for the next phase. God help us all.
Mel Waters made his final call to Coast AM on February 21, 2002. He died 3 weeks later at a hospice facility in Portland, Oregon. According to the attending physician, his final words were, "The Hole remembers everything. Tell them the Hole remembers." The property in Kittitas County remains restricted to this day, though official records show no current federal research activities in the area. Local residents report that the wildlife has never returned, and that some nights when the wind is just right, you can still hear sounds rising from somewhere deep in the earth.